If you've ever looked at a map, whether it was on a board game, whether it was on a TTRPG module, or on a video game such as World of Warcraft, you have probably noticed that the map itself contains key locations and other important items. But what you probably didn't realize is that the map itself told a story. Mountains don't just take up space on a map. They perhaps divide kingdoms, they hold secrets, and they can challenge the hero. Rivers don't just carry water or carry the passengers or the travelers or the heroes through the landscape. And it's not a place where you just go fishing. Rivers carry trade routes. They are border lines. They power cities in some genres of gaming. And more importantly, they could hide really cool tidbits and lore in that world. In a well-built world, geography isn't just scenery, it's part of the story. My name is Brian, and welcome back to the Bearded Nerd Podcast, your source of storytelling tools, world-building wisdom, and all things tabletop. And today we're diving into how you can use geography to tell a better, deeper, and more immersive story in your campaign. Because your map is more than just a backdrop. It is a narrative engine. We'll talk about how terrain dictates your world building. We'll also go into how the land can be used to reflect or challenge your players. And then lastly, we're going to actually provide the tools in your world building journey that will help you create a story-driven narrative using geography. With all that being said, let's jump into this episode of the Bearded Nerd Podcast. First and foremost, geography shapes culture, politics, and conflict. In my opinion, each part of geography is going to passively or actively shape that world, and it will do things to it. So, for example, mountains usually provide isolation, and from a story perspective, it can represent secrets. So, a culture that is centered around the mountains can be a culture that is insular, protective, and deeply rooted in tradition. It's one of the reasons why dwarves are so reflected in the mountains. They almost reflect this type of culture, one that is traditional, one that is protective and insular. They can also provide really good story narratives, such as hidden monasteries, ancient ruins, or rare materials, things that are hidden in secret. Mountains do a really good job at showcasing that. On the contrary, rivers and lakes are a great place for exposure, trade, boundaries, life, things that blossom and bloom. Natural borders between nations or regions are created with rivers and lakes, but it seems open, it seems friendlier, right? There are hub cities that obviously grow from where the rivers meet. Look at Pittsburgh in our world. But there are just notions of openness and travel when you look at a river or a lake, as well as serenity. But to contrast that, pirates, water spirits, bridge tolls, things of that nature that provide a little bit of restraint or even give a little bit of pushback to that open and wild aspect of it is a really good callback, and it's a really good way to challenge the party. Moving from there, though, you have deserts and wastelands. This really reflects hardship and nomadic cultures. Look at the Fremen in Dune. They live in a desert wasteland where water is revered, it is holy, and it is sacred to the people. for multiple reasons. So you see survivors and warriors that are strong, adaptive, and there is lore heavy connotations with those people. But it's also a great place to place ancient ruins, right? Beneath the sand. You can have sand ships or towers that are placed there, and it makes the players, specifically your players, think of why they're there. And then lastly, oceans and islands. This has always communicated exploration, myth, and isolation. Oceanic campaigns change navigation, communication, and stakes in a unique way. I was going to say a way more unique way, but in reality, it changes it in an interesting way because maritime travel is way different than land travel. I know I'm stating the obvious, but it is really true when we break it down that maritime travel in an open, what seems to be endless ocean communicates something different when we are telling a story. In my world, there are the Suncrest Mountains that divide the continent of Ecopia from east to west. These are the mountains that most people revere, but also most people in the world have a fear of. Not only because that's where the dwarves primarily reside, but they crest the sky. They almost kiss the sky. And it is a journey that would take much courage for anyone to traverse without going through the appropriate means of within the mountains through the dwarven kingdoms. So that connotation is something that's helped build the world and place within my players' minds and hearts an idea of, oh, this could be a challenge that we could go through, or this could be a place that we can explore. It plants a small seed of curiosity. But once you establish where you want your mountains and your lakes and rivers and everything to be, you got to think about how to tie this all together. Again, in some of my latest episodes, we've talked about how cities develop. We talk about world building with this practical sense of you develop a city because it's known for a particular thing. Well, now this is where we put it together. A coastal city may have started because it was a hub where fishermen came together to trade with merchants to sell their wares. And then it grew and grew and grew. So you utilize that. You start tying the geography into the narrative parts of it. You use the land to reflect or challenge your player's journey. There will be physical obstacles, right? And this is one out of the 4 things that I would recommend on how to tie it together. Use physical obstacles to mirror emotional ones. A shattered glacier could reflect party tension, right? A haunted forest could force the players to face literal and metaphorical shadows. Maybe the paladin is running away from their past, and when they go into the haunted forest, the party gets separated, but they are challenged with some sort of, maybe stereotypical, I'm going to fight the baddie within me and face my fears, right? You could do something like that. But either way, you can use those physical obstacles to mirror an emotional one that is written in the backstory. Second, a great way to tie in geography to narrative is by changing terrain signals. For example, if you want to create a moment, if you will, of hope, include greener lands, right? A green pasture that is almost a sea of grass oftentimes promotes this idea of hope. Now, if you want to showcase that there's chaos spreading, maybe utilize a volcanic upheaval, right? When you change the terrain, it actually signals the story's progress. It provides an emotional or a narrative ploy, and most of the time both, to tell your players, hey, this thing is changing and something's going about it. Remember, as a caveat, when you're describing, when you are depicting things in your world and in your game, you're always throwing it back to your players to say, what do you do? How do you respond? Right? It's a very short way of saying, how does your character respond to this particular thing that is going on in the world? And then they can reply. But aside from that, the third and fourth way to tie geography to narrative arcs is by using geography as a countdown clock, right? In combat or in some other formats, exploration, storytelling, whatever you want to call it. You can use things like the rising of floodwaters or melting glaciers or a creeping desert as a way to allude to your players that the clock is ticking and that they are soon approaching the next arc, the next part of the story, the next page, chapter, whatever you want to call it. And then lastly, the geopolitical shifts that are tied to the terrain, right? If your players go through the northern passes, it means that there is some sort of thing that's going to happen. Let's say, for example, your players can cross the northern pass. It means that it's thawed out, which then means that invaders can now return and raid those parts of the land, right? Or, hey, the river has changed course due to this thing. Therefore, it's making an old border meaningless, which then causes some sort of geopolitical tension, right? You can use those things as a way to create tension and drama in your story, like Matt Colville mentions in his series. And here's an example of a story hook that you can use, or an encounter hook even. Your players reach a mountain pass, only to find it collapse by a rock slide. Locals say the mountain spirit is angry. And maybe there's a shortcut that goes through some old tunnels. But typically those who go through it never return. So you place that at the feet of your players and let them decide. And it creates a really cool hook that the players can pursue. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the tools and questions that you would utilize for story building. So first and foremost, when you are going to use some sort of map or just world build, right? You want to ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one, what natural barriers shaped the nations or the kingdoms that are present in your world? Did the mountains play a big part of it? Did a river or lake, or maybe the fertile lands play something of a role in that kingdom? Think about it and build from there. Second, what has the climate, or how has the climate changed history in your world? Was there an ice age? Was there a heat age, so to speak? What are the things that changed the actual history and impacted the people of your world? The third question, which I really like, is what terrain is considered sacred, dangerous, or forbidden? Are there certain areas that are sacred to the people? Are there pilgrimages that are made by the gods or the followers of those deities in your world? And then lastly, what monsters or magic are tied to geographic features, right? So is there a particular monster that is associated with the swamplands, right? Maybe you are playing Dungeons and Dragons, or maybe you're playing another RPG that would have specific monsters based upon that. So those are the questions you want to ask yourself for world building. And once you figure that out and you have those answers, I recommend using Incarnate for your terrain making. You can use Wonder Draft as well. But either way, you want to use one of those tools as a great way to create dynamic terrain maps, right? You can use regional, you can use parchments, you can use citywide. Like you could be very granular and make cities and battle maps, right? Or you can make just regional and kind of entire land, structure, country, continent wide maps that would help tell that story, right? World maps, if you will. But I highly recommend using a tool like that because it will get you on paper, it'll get those thoughts on paper, and it looks really good. I have experience with Incarnate. I don't have too much experience with Wonderdraft, but I highly recommend what works for you. What works for me is Incarnate personally. But with that being said, you can also utilize just your typical hex crawl. So you can kind of let the geography generate encounters and just go from there, right? You don't have to necessarily have the encounter generate the geography. But think about hex crawls, think about those type of styles, and then again, put it on paper. Even if you are using graph paper or notebook paper, I want to make sure that you feel like you have an easier, entry, right? There's no barrier for entry. I want you to feel comfortable. So again, once you ask yourself those questions, go ahead and put those on paper. But with that being said, the story doesn't always come from dialogue. Remember that. It doesn't always come from dice. Although dice plays a major role, the story can come from things like the cliffs of your world, the coastlines, the craters, the mountains, the lakes and rivers. Your geography can spark legends. They can raise empires. Or they can bury the secrets that your players may never find, but they'll always feel it in some form or fashion. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of the Bearded Nerd Podcast, your source of storytelling tools, world building wisdom, and all things tabletop. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and subscribe for more weekly content to inspire your table. Check out Patreon for bonus map building prompts, regional lore generators, and campaign tools. And then let me know on social media what's your favorite terrain-based encounter or world building detail. I hope you all have a great day. Much love and keep gaming.